This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me down this Thursday, the last day of the first quarter. We'll talk more about the implications of that a little bit later. But as we talked about yesterday, J.C. Watts will be with us today as we talk about his new book, Dig Deep. And I think you're really going to enjoy that. And if you are not familiar with him, he served, of course, as the quarterback at the University of Oklahoma Sooners, took them to 2 Orange Bowl championships, and also played in professional ball up in Canada for a while. Probably best known to most of our listeners as an individual we've interviewed before, as someone who was elected to statewide office first in Oklahoma and then to the United States Congress, served there 4 terms, and then came back into the private sector and has been very much involved in all sorts of aspects of business. But also, interestingly enough, and this is an organization that my wife and I have been giving to for many years, is the president of Feed the Children in Oklahoma City. His previous book is What Color is a Conservative? My Life and My Politics. His new book is Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within. J.C. Watts, Jr., thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, how in the world are you?
I'm good, and it is so great to hear your voice. We sometimes would interview you when we were at the National Religious Broadcasters up in Washington, D.C., and things of that nature, and certainly been following your career. And just the other day when we were doing our taxes, I was just looking at the number of contributions we've given to Feed the Children, and I know that's a relatively recent change in your life, but it's a great organization we were supporting before you joined with it, and even more excited about your involvement with it now.
Well, Kerby, thank you. And I have, I just joined the Feed the Children team on February 1st of this year, not even 2 months ago. I guess 2 months ago tomorrow, but I'm tickled about that. It's eventually going to get me back to the state of Oklahoma, and
that's going to be a great opportunity. I would think so as well. Did we lose you? I think we lost him. So right off the bat, we lost him. So we'll come back and see if we can connect up with him in just a minute. J.C. Watts has been with us, and we'll give you a chance to join that conversation as we talk with him. Let me just mention, while we're waiting for him to join us, that yesterday we did talk a little bit about what was happening in Georgia and North Carolina. Of course, the one in Georgia had to do with the fact that the governor decided to veto a bill that I think certainly deserved some attention, and certainly that is something that we talked about. And of course, we even got into whether or not there was maybe a double standard on the part of Disney, and certainly that is something that I'm going to be addressing a little bit more next week. And of course, we talked about up in North Carolina as well, the bathroom bill, HB2, and the kind of flack that they're receiving there as well. So we'll be certainly trying to pick up on some of those issues on our Friday weekend edition. Going to have a number of activists as well as lawyers to really address that issue. So if you would like to weigh in with some of the comments, then we'll be talking about that and many other issues as we have Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis, as well as Chelsea Yeoman. So we're going to have quite a roundtable. And I think we have J.C. Watts back with us now, don't we?
Yeah, Kerby, I gave you my very best pitch on Feed the Children, and we missed it.
Yeah, we missed it. We'll give the pitch again, because I would love our listeners to support that organization, as my wife and I have for many years.
Well, you're kind, and thank you very much. I joined the team on February 1st, so it's been about 2 months. And, we last year fed about 9 million kids in the United States, and every day last year we fed about 263,000 kids every day in about 18 different countries. And so they've done good work. They're in the state of Oklahoma. They are on the tip of the spear for hunger and poverty and dealing with those things, and I'm just plumb tickled to be a part of them now.
Well, again, let me encourage people to find out a little bit more about that organization. We'll get to that a little bit later. But we also, of course, have a link to feedthechildren.org, so people can go there and find out about that. But we also want to talk about your book, because we have a place for people to order it. I'm sure they'll be finding it in the local bookstore as well. and it is published by Regnery. But as you've been watching the political campaign, and I'll focus primarily, I guess, on the presidential campaign since this is a national program, there are some lessons in your book that I think some of the candidates could learn, lessons about humility and thankfulness and gratitude that certainly are maybe not the reason you wrote the book, but certainly some reasons why I would want to hand this book to some of those presidential candidates to maybe see if they could change their act. What are your thoughts?
Well, Kerby, interestingly, when I started writing the book 7-8 months ago, I really didn't. It was not a political book. It's more about using my circumstances, my experiences, and the wisdom that I gained from it to help people through their challenges. But ironically, I do think it speaks to some of the, I think, things that we see happening in the political arena today. For instance, I'm always interested when I hear people say, "That's just the way I am."
Yeah.
If that's a 15-year-old, you're not so concerned. But if you've got someone over 65 saying that's just the way I am, that tells me that humility is not a part of their DNA. They don't want to be corrected, and they don't want to be held accountable. And I do think that God wants to take us all to the next level in our personal growth, and it concerns me not just if you hear someone who's running for city council say that, but man, the leader of the free world that says that's quite bothersome to me.
I would think so. Let's, if we can, maybe tell a little of your story. And I've known a lot of your story, but there was one that I did not know, and that is from the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. And it helped me understand that you had faced some maybe unjust scrutiny and some questions that surfaced there. Because when you actually joined, you had to give this very long kind of swearing in that you did not have any possibility of corruption. But you're not there 2 years when all of a sudden there's a major investigation into the corporation, not of you, but because you were there, you all of a sudden were the attention of a tremendous amount of scrutiny, weren't you?
I talk about in Dig Deep, Kerby, I talk about 7 truths, and in the first chapter, I talked about the truth, what adversity can do for us if we approach it the right way. And as you said, I was swept up into an investigation that started in 1988, before I got to the state agency I was elected to, and boy, it was painful, it was hurtful, and I found myself, J.C. Watts, former quarterback at the University of Oklahoma, is pretty sexy to kind of target me with what the press was doing, and it was very hurtful. And I remember one day looking into the camera, this station that was targeting me and had me on the news 3 or 4 times a week, and I was a youth pastor at the time as well. And I remember looking into the camera one day and saying these words. I said, "I don't know what's going on with this investigation. I will cooperate fully. And from the perspective of faith," I said, "and I will wait the results in peace." Well, needless to say, I left the agency after 4 years of a 6-year term. I ran for Congress, got elected, got reelected in every one of my campaigns. But I look back and say, I don't look back at what it did to me. I look back at what it did for me.
We'll continue to talk about some of those lessons from Dig Deep.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Congress is considering a bill to fight government zombies. That's the name that Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers gives to the many government programs that have never been reauthorized by Congress. These Walking Dead programs continue to function with little or no government oversight. Her bill would gradually cut funding for unauthorized government programs in order to compel Congress to take action on them. Currently, the federal government funds 256 unauthorized programs costing $310 billion. This even includes entire agencies like the State Department. And that raises a point. Would Congress refuse to refund the State Department? Well, certainly not. But imagine the oversight that would occur if even the State Department had to come to Congress and explain its action. Representative Rogers notes that many of these agencies have become arrogant. They've become disconnected from their mission, and she believes that this bill restores accountability with the elected representatives. Under the bill, the programs that have expired authorizations would be subject to a 10% spending cut the first year of unauthorized status and a 15% cut in the second and third years. If Congress fails to reauthorize after that time, the program will be sunsetted. All funding would disappear. In addition to the sunset process, the bill also creates a Spending Accountability Commission to oversee the authorization schedule and review all mandatory spending programs. Citizens and candidates all complain about the spending and the lack of accountability that we rarely see in concrete programs that would change the current system in Washington. An automatic cut in spending will get the attention of the agency and the members of Congress. This is the type of fiscal discipline we need in Congress. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Now playing, rated PG, miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A book out called Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within. It is written by our guest, J.C. Watts Jr. It's published by Regnery. We have information about it in case you would like to order it, and you'll probably be able to find it in your local bookstore. J.C. Watts, you talked a little bit about it's not what they did to me, it's what they did for me. And you really help us in this book to understand that sometimes we have to turn away from the roar of the crowd or the criticism of our critics, not to drink from the cup of victimhood, and to recognize that we need to dig deep. And so for people out there that are struggling with some kind of adversity, whether they're in political offices you were at the time, or whether they're dealing with problems in their church or family, what might you recommend? Because you found that
Well, Kerby, I think, again, as I said, I look back on many circumstances in my life, and I talk about adversity in the first chapter, and I think today, I'm grateful today, not what it did to me, but what it did for me. And, you know, faith is about standing on the truth of God's Word, and faith is like a muscle. And the more you exercise that muscle and the more you use it, the stronger that muscle's going to get. And faith is the same way. The more you stand on it and the more you use it and exercise it, the stronger it's going to get. And I've surely had times to do that, but in those times of adversity, it is so easy to drink from the cup of victimhood, or to wrap ourselves in a blanket of victimhood. And Kerby, I've done it, you've done it, your listeners have done it, we all have done it. But what my book is about, and what Dig Deep is about, is saying, you know, drilling into the core of who we are and drawing out the strength to achieve, and summoning the better version of J.C. Watts Jr. who lives within me, or summoning the better version of every one of us to fight another day, to fight another week, to go another down, to fight through the bad deal, fight, you know, through the bad relationship. But you know, every storm runs out of rain. And after every storm, there's a rainbow. The sun's going to shine again. But Kerby, it's so hard for us to see that in the difficulty of our circumstances, and the wind still blows, and the sun still shines, and we've got a family, and we're working, and the birds are still chirping, but we don't see all of that in our difficulties. And then when we get through the difficulties, we notice those things, and they were there all along. We just pay so much attention to our adversities and to the challenges that we don't pay any attention to the wonderful things that's around us.
Gratitude. What a great antidote to some of that. And that kind of leads into the second chapter where you talk about digging deep to let go. You quote from Booker T. Washington, "I will not permit any man to narrow and degrade my soul by making me hate him." And a lot of this had to do with wrestling of whether or not you should apologize to someone, and you didn't do anything wrong. He did. And yet you're saying to the Lord, why should I have to apologize to him? And you even quote from this idea of a grievance industrial complex. So talk about that, because asking for forgiveness from a person who should have been asking you for forgiveness was another great challenge in your life, wasn't it?
Well, the Lord had kind of dealt with my heart to apologize to this gentleman who had kind of pulled me into this investigation. And Kerby, I'm just blatantly honest with you. I struggle with that. I struggled with that for a long time. I wrestled with God. I wrestled with myself, and I finally got to the point that I'm wrestling with God, and I'm saying, God, why should I apologize to him? I did nothing to him. and just in the quietness of my heart, the Lord said, you're wanting to know how to do better? Well, if you want to know how to do life better, you've got to be able to forgive. And so I mustered up the courage and the strength to go and forgive him. And I finally had one final discussion with God. And I said, hey, God, look, if I forgive him, that's going to make him right. But, Kerby, I discovered it didn't make him right. It made me free.
Yes.
And that's what God was trying to do. Unforgiveness is like Kerby drinking poison and expecting it to kill JC. It doesn't work like that. When we forgive, and it's not always easy. I will admit that it is tough. It can be a process, and it's very difficult. But when we forgive, man, we get rid of a burden and a burr under our saddle that we had allowed people to control us from their graves. I mean, we've got people. Some people have people that's dead in their graves, and they said something to them or didn't say something to them when they were living, or they did something to them or didn't do anything to them, and they control us from their grave because we just think about them. There's people in our high school that we went to high school with that is 40 mention their very name. It just does something to our emotions. And so we should not allow people to control our emotions. And that's what God was dealing with me about, to say, hey, you've got to draw on the courage and the strength to let it go. Forgiveness is a wonderful, wonderful medicine for the soul of man.
Wonderful. One other one I wanted to get to just before we take another one of our breaks, Chapter 3, Unlearn and Rethink. You even have a quote there about the fact that progress only happens with change, and you point out that some of the rarest things on this earth right now are an adult who's willing to change his mind about something of importance. And if we're going to, again, dig deep, one of those truths is the willingness to be able to change, the willingness first to change, and then the strength to be able to change.
No question. Unlearning is about as hard as forgiving. Because, Kerby, we say, well, that's my culture, that's the way I was raised, that's the way my mother's mother cooked it, or that's the way they did it, and even, Kerby, in our faith. I mean, if we go to church on Sunday not out of tradition, but if we go to church on Sunday for life change, we're going to have to do some unlearning, and we're going to have to rethink some things. And we think that because it's tradition or it's culture, that's the best way to do it. And traditions in and of themselves are not bad. But when tradition says, well, I've been cooking these beans like this for the last 40 years, and that's where I'm going to continue doing it, then when somebody comes along and says, hey, JC, you don't have to put the fat back and the salt pork and the beans. You can put seasoning in them. They're just as good. They're a whole lot more healthy. Just rethinking and unlearning a lot of bad habits. We hang on to those habits simply because our culture says we should cook the beans with the fat back. Our tradition says that's the way we've done it for the last 200 years. It doesn't make it right or best because it's the way our culture or tradition tells us. And again, when we celebrate Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving and birthdays, that's not a bad tradition. But we do lock ourselves into traditions, even, Kerby, in our faith.
Yes.
We lock ourselves into traditions that says that's just the way we've done it for the last 200 years.
That's
so
for sure.
Again, it's about doing life better, and if we choose to do life better and read Scripture, not to read Scripture, but to allow Scripture to read us,
Very good.
That's when we really see God taking us to another level of glory.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation with J.C. Watts, who, of course, have heard the last 6 words of a church. We've never done it that way before. So, again, we'll learn some lessons from J.C. Watts' 7 Truths to Finding Strength Within. The book is entitled Dig Deep. It is published by Regnerich. You'll probably be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link there in case you wanted to order it immediately. And for those of you that want to get it on your Kindle, you can start reading the moment you get it. So let's again encourage you to visit the website at pointofview.net. You'll find out more about J.C. Watts. You'll find out a little bit more about this other organization we talked about, Feed the Children, and much more. But as you go to the website, don't forget that we are coming to the end today of our first quarter. We're about 5 weeks behind in giving. So this is why we've asked you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And of course, we're going to mention some more about it in just a minute. But I would encourage those of you, especially that would want to send us a check, make sure you put it in the mail today and make it out to Point of View and send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Of course, we have a link on the website, and we sent out an email so you can follow up that way. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back with more right after this.
Look at the presidential campaign and you tell me, does America need more or less of a Christian witness right now? Today is the final day of the first quarter of 2016, and support for Point of View is running about 5 weeks behind where it needs to be. Congress can run deficits virtually forever, but we can't. And I plead with you, do something about that today, right now. I'm asking you to stop what you're doing just for a moment. Go online or pick up the phone. Make the most generous investment you can to touch lives across the nation, to teach listeners how to take our faith into the culture. Visit pointofview.net. Make a few clicks and donate now. Pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Please, we need you to respond today. Today, we need you to support Point of View. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for your support.
Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. J.C. Watts, and he is an individual that has certainly been providing a great perspective on some of these issues. Dig deep, 7 truths to finding the strength within, and we have been talking about this idea of unlearn and rethink. And J.C. Watts, let me for just a minute ask about that, because in your book you say it sometimes is more important what you unlearn than what you learn, and it seems to me that sometimes we think, well, we just need more information, but sometimes what we think we know is wrong, and we really need to unlearn some of those lessons, don't we?
No question. And I was talking about tradition before the break and how tradition and culture locks us into bad thinking. I remember, Kerby, about 8-9 years ago, my wife and I had gone through some challenging times, and I remember I was ordained in the Baptist church, and I remember we joined a non-denominational church, and in the Baptist church, I mean, you see it a lot more frequently today, what I'm about to share with you, but back in the days I was growing up, Baptist churches, you didn't hold your hands up in praise in church, and the pastor was teaching us about when you go to church on Sunday, you're there to praise and to worship God. You're not there, because of who's sitting to your left or to your right. You're saying, Lord, speak to my heart. And Kerby, we were so grateful for what God had done. And I remember the first time I raised my hand to say, thank you, Lord, for what you brought us through. It just kind of felt strange, because I wasn't, that's not the way my culture worshiped. But at the end of the day, I thought, God has been so good to me. He has brought us through such a difficult time. And at the end of the day, I said, I don't care what other people think. Man, I'll moonwalk and do it. I'm so grateful for his mercy and his grace. And Kerby, if the truth be told, when we stop and take stock in our lives, we can look back and say, my soul looks back and wonder how I got over. And it was strictly and totally just God's grace and God's faithfulness and goodness to us that got us there. And so unlearning those old traditions can lock us into some bad habits, even in our diet. I've said many times, I love beans. I love pinto beans, black beans, lima beans, red beans. And in my culture, we eat beans, you cook them, and salt pork and fatback or ham hocks, and I thought it was communism not to cook them like that. And then
that's pretty good.
All of a sudden, my wife starts to cook them and just put seasoning in them. And Kerby, I couldn't tell any difference in the taste, and they were much better for me.
A lot healthier.
And so it's a lot healthier. And so again, just unlearning a lot of those, how we cook things culturally. I've learned that, to bake things more, don't fry them and don't, batter them so. And most of the time I'm eating, pretty well. Now, sometimes I'm not as good as I should be, but I've had to unlearn a lot of things about my diet. And I've discovered that those things we learned in 3rd, 4th grade health class, about 40, they started to make a whole lot of sense.
Very good. Again, we are talking about this wonderful book, Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within. If you'd like to join us, we're talking today with J.C. Watts Jr., and certainly you can join us, 1-800-351-1212. Just before we get off of that, one of the things you talk about is that this lesson of unlearning and rethinking is certainly important in terms of addressing the racial divide in America. And that is that unless we are overcoming some of these divisions and maybe rethinking and willing to learn some new things, we'll never understand each other's culture. And that affects not only the culture, but even our politics, doesn't it?
You bet it does. And Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within, Kerby, I talk about confirmation bias. Back in about 2007 or 8, I was on TV on one of the current affairs shows with a guy that when we finished, he said, I just hate him. I just hate him. And I said, who are you talking about? He said, Bush. I just hate George Bush. Well, fast forward about 6 years down the road, I was with the same guy, and we were talking, and he said, I just don't understand why they hate him so much. And I said, who are you talking about? He said, President Obama. Now, this is the same guy that 6 years prior told me that he hated George Bush. And you know what, Kerby? I don't think he was being hypocritical. I think what he was just confirming his bias with President Obama, because he wanted to like him. And the fact is, we all have done that. We don't watch current affairs shows. Many of us don't watch current affairs shows looking for the truth. We watch Fox and CNN and MSNBC looking for somebody to confirm our opinions, to confirm our bias. And we have things in politics. You could have a white police officer that do 99 things that's good, but if you think they're bad, that one time that you catch a police officer doing the wrong thing, you say, see, I told you. That's just the way they are. It's confirming your bias. The same thing with black kids, with black men. You know, we'll think that black men are a certain way, and J.C. Watts can do 99, good things, and then I do one bad thing, and people will say, see, I told you. It's confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to get beyond that. And one thing that really points out and affirms that and speaks to that, about 7-8 years ago, you may remember the situation in Durham, North Carolina with the Duke lacrosse team. You had a white Duke lacrosse team who were seen as, wealthy white guys. They did have a party, but this young black lady accused them of raping her. And Kerby, at the end of the day, every one of those young men, they were innocent. And the district attorney withheld evidence that would have exonerated them. But you look at that circumstance, it would confirm every bias that anybody had, right or left, black or white, wanted to have. It would have confirmed their bias. But at the end of the day, these young men, they were exonerated, and somebody chose, because of their bias, chose to purposely try and ruin these young men's lives for political gain. And so I've had experiences in my life that yes, I will say not all black people are crooks or thugs, and I talk about some circumstances with profiling and some run-ins I've had with police officers that would confirm that. But I'm not prepared to say that all police officers are bad, because my dad was a police officer.
Yes.
I've got people in my family who are police officers today. So I don't believe police officers are always wrong. I just don't believe they're always right. I believe that all black men are thugs. I believe there are some. I don't believe all. So it just, my experiences, my circumstances forces me or compels me to say, give me the whole story. Give me the facts. Give me the truth. And whatever the truth is, I'll defend that, even if it goes against what I want to believe. We have these things happen, and we buy into them to protect the narrative that we want to execute, not necessarily because it's the truth. We want our biases confirmed, and that's, again, confirmation bias.
J.C. Watts Jr. with us as we talk about his book, Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding Strength Within. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Georgia. Helen, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Thank you, Kerby. I so resonate with what J.C. is speaking about. I became a Christian when I was 40 years old. I'm in my 60s now, but I knew nothing about the Bible, and it was so much easier for people to help me to learn the truth than to have to unlearn first. But what I wanted to say is my family immigrated from Denmark, and the racism in Atlanta, Georgia was horrific back in the late 50s and 60s. And right now, a group of us have started a unity movement, and it includes the chief of police and the mayor, and we're a diverse group in the small historical town of Madison, Georgia. And what we've been trying to do to break down the cultural divide and the races and the traditions and all this that you're talking about is encourage people to trade places. But, like blacks go to white churches and so forth, because the culture is so ingrained, from years of thinking that blacks should be in their parts of the world and we should be in our parts of the world.
All these barriers and everything. I need to go to a break. So can I keep Helen you on? And I'd love to get a comment from J.C. Watts, but we have one of those mandatory breaks that came up every once in a while. So we'll take that break. And as we go to the break, this will be a great time for you to find out a little bit more about J.C. Watts. You can go to our website, pointofview.net. That will give you a link. And, of course, you can also even order the book if you're interested. Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within. We'll take a short break, come back, and get some comments from J.C. Watts right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us J.C. Watts as we talk about his book, Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding Strength Within. It's published by Regnery. We have information about it on our website. And J.C., what she's suggesting, I know some churches have done. I know my home church over the years has switched really talk about in your book.
Well, Kerby, as Helen was talking about that, and you've mentioned with Tony, I preached it in Cleveland, Oklahoma, probably 25 years ago, and there's a church, and the pastor was telling me that they exchanged pulpits with the black pastor in Tulsa, and he said, black churches get pretty lively, and he said, I'm not used to my church saying amen and kind of egging me on.
Yes.
And he said,
there's
man,
a cadence there, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
He said, I had this old sister on the front row. She got to saying amen. He said, JC, I got to tell you, that old sister about preached me to death.
So that's a great opportunity.
But what Helen was saying, it's so true. And Helen, I remember the time in my life that I had to sit in the balcony of the movie theater at the White Theater. I couldn't swim in the public swimming pool in my hometown of Eufaula, Oklahoma, and I had guys that quit the football team when I was moved to quarterback because they said they didn't feel right playing behind a black quarterback. However, I don't believe that because of those circumstances that all white people are racist or they're bad, because I've had as many white people so in my life that I stand on their shoulders. Considering where I am today, I stood on their shoulders. Coaches that wouldn't let me quit. I tried to quit, they wouldn't allow me to quit.
Yes.
I stand on the shoulders of Abraham Lincoln and Reverend King and Frederick Douglass and Billy Graham who stood with Reverend King in some very difficult times. So again, I think, however, relationships, Kerby, what Helen and their church and what that community is doing, relationship covers a multitude of sin. And I learned that in athletics because, in the locker room, Kerby and I played together. He's white, I'm black. Kerby says something in the locker room that maybe on the streets would seem to be racist, or JC would say something to Kerby that in the locker room, on the streets, it would seem insensitive. But, because of our relationship, Kerby says, oh, that's JC. I've known him for 4 or 5 years. He didn't mean anything by that. Or I say, oh, that's Kerby. He didn't mean it. I've known him for 4 or 5 years. Don't go there. I know him. That's you're totally taking that out of context, or whatever the case might be. But what Helen and that community is doing, they are establishing relationships, and we've gotten people so afraid. Kerby, I want you as a white male, and I want Helen as a white female to be able to ask JC as a black man whatever you all want to ask me, because we grow like that. I don't want you all to be so sensitive, and I don't want to be so sensitive about you all that we get to the point that I say, I'd like to ask Kerby that, but I might not say it the right way, or my lips might not be framed the right way, or my mannerisms might not be right, and they'll take it the wrong way. So I just won't ask. I think that's the worst thing we can do, especially in the church. That's the worst thing we can do for advancing the kingdom, is to be so sensitive that we don't ask. I think that hurts the dialogue. I think my white staffers, I think they learned a whole lot about black people because they work for a black man. You know what? I've learned a whole lot about, the white community because I operate in the white community. I've got white employees, and I have never been afraid to say, Kerby, I'm just going to tell you, I ask this with the right heart, but tell me, why do you all do this in the white community? And I want you to have the same freedom to ask me the same thing.
Well said. Let's take one more phone call real quick. Barbara in Texas. I think you used to live in Oklahoma.
Yes, I did, and I am so excited to hear JC's voice. Oh, gosh. You're the same wonderful character that you were when I lived there. I lived in Oklahoma a total of 10 years, but 8 of those years I was with the Boys and Girls Club, and we had some dealings and some interactions with you, and gosh, I'm just so excited to hear your voice.
Well, Barbara, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, my daughters, a couple of my daughters were Girl Scouts once upon a time. So, we had Girl Scouts in our home on numerous occasions.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, and I'm so excited for your new book. I've wondered over the years, what became of you, and your message is so important. I'm just thrilled, to hear your perspective on racial issues and such. We are just all God's children, and it's like, golly, we're a family that's at odds with each other, and we just can't do that.
For sure.
Well, and Barbara, I think several things need to happen. And again, the book was not written as a political book. It was written about just taking my life's experiences from the ministry, from football, from politics, from business, being an employer and an employee, and taking all of those experiences. And there was just a time in my life that I made a conscious decision to say, Lord, to ask God, help me to do life better. And I am too selfish. I am too proud. I am too dysfunctional, and the most perfect person, the only perfect about me is my imperfections. and I wanted to peel the pages to say, Lord, help me do life better. And Kerby, we get ourselves in trouble, not for being dysfunctional necessarily, but when we make our dysfunctions our normal.
Yes.
And as I said at the outset of our conversation, our time together today, I said, when people say that's just the way I am, and we've seen that a lot in the presidential race, when somebody's approaching 70 and they say that's just the way I am,
they got to change. That's right.
That's right. They're not looking to change.
Sure. Well, we're just about out of time, and I just wanted to again mention about 220 pages in this book, Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within. And we've only talked about a few because you're talking about dig deep to see past the labels, dig deep to do life better, and dig deep to change your attitude, and dig deep to stand on broad shoulders and to practice God's perseverance and all sorts of other issues. So hope we can do this again. J.C. Watts, everybody's kind of wondered how you were doing, and I think we've given them a chance to know a little bit more about you today, and we've covered only a few of the principles, so that's why people need to get the book. So thank you for being with us on Point of View. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, Kerby, you awfully kind to have me on. Thank you very much, and I look forward to it.
We are. Well, that's all we have for this first hour. And let me just mention, we're coming to the end. Today is the end of our first quarter. And so, as we mentioned before, this is Thursday, and it's March 31st. And if you want to help us out, and I would hope that you would, we're about 5 weeks behind. And so we really do need to hear from you. So there are a couple of ways you can do it. First of all, of course, is the website, pointofview.net. We have a banner there on the right-hand side. It says, Close the Gap. Well, you help us close the gap. And so if you click on that, that is a way that you can give. Number 2, of course, I sent out an email, and as we did that, you can follow the link there as well. Of course, some of you might want to call rather than go online. You can do that as well. But let me also mention, some of you are like me, old school. You just say, I'd rather write out a check. And even yesterday, I was writing out a check to some of the donations I made. And so you make that check out to Point of View. Send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Get it in the mail today. We'd love to have it count in our first quarter. It would certainly be an encouragement to each one of us here. And as I said, we're about 5 weeks behind. Help us close the gap. Let's take a break. When we come back, Andy Crouch will be with us. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Columbia Pictures presents, in association with Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. When 10-year-old Anna Bean develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are everywhere.
Then, after Anna has a freak accident, a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner, now playing. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You don't have to look very hard to see that America needs a strong... Today is the end of the first quarter of 2016, and support for Point of View is running about 5 whole weeks behind. Please stop what you're doing just for a moment and make the most generous investment you can to touch lives across the nation. Visit pointofview.net, make a few clicks, and donate now. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Today is the day. We need you to respond right now. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about strength and weakness, about leadership skills, and much more as we talk with our good friend Andy Crouch. He's been on the program with us many times before as we've talked about, for example, his book, Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, as well as Culture Making, which dealt very much about, in a sense, recovering our calling, our creative calling. But today we're going to talk about this new book, Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love, Risk, and True Flourishing. He is the executive editor of Christianity Today, also has been a senior fellow with the International Justice Missions, the IJM Institute. We've talked about that before here on the program. Mentioned some of his books, as well as, of course, his documentary series that he's been involved with, Where Faith and Culture Meet and Round Trip. He has a degree in classics from Cornell University, a classically trained musician, and MDiv from Boston University School of Theology. And Andy, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, Kerby. I'm so glad to be here.
I enjoy your books because you kind of take on some of these sort of abstract ideas and give them some concreteness, if you will. You know, when you talk about power, or you talk about, as we're going to do here, strong and weak, these are words that are, to be honest, I'm not so much of an abstract person, so they tend to be a little bit ethereal. But when you start putting some graphs and charts, I go, I get it now, and now I understand this for the first time. So maybe you do that just so you can understand him, or maybe you've already understood him and just trying to help the rest of us figure it out, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, you know, they say writers don't write to tell other people what we think. We actually write to find out what we think. So this is my way of thinking through these big, complicated topics and finding some really clear ways of thinking about kind of who we're meant to be in the world as Christians.
Let me, if I can, for just a minute, encourage some of our listeners to get something to write with. And you can draw kind of an X, or think of your X-axis and your Y-axis. I know I'm taking you back to mathematics here for just a minute, but this graph is so helpful because on the Y-axis, running north and south, if you will, you have authority. Then on the X-axis, running east and west, you have vulnerability. And then in each one of those four quadrants, you have some of the things we're going to talk about. Now, but later you also get into firmness and warmth. So again, the same kind of idea, firmness north and south, warmth left and right. So you can look at both of those ideas. But I thought that was a very creative way to begin to develop the book. And if people aren't visual, they can just draw out, like I said, just the old XY axis that we had to do when we were in math, right? You've done that before. And then helped us understand the difference between, say, flourishing and exploiting and withdrawing and suffering. And for anybody that's a leader, Andy, this is a struggle that we have, and all of us are leaders in some way. I mean, we're talking about trying to elect the next leader of the free world, but whether you are running for the presidency, or whether you're a pastor in a church, or whether you're a husband in a home, or whether you find yourself leading a small group, or whether you're just maybe having some kind of leadership with your kids, we all have, in some way or another, have to make sense of what characteristics a leader will have. And you certainly address some of those in your previous book, Playing God, but this one, you get into more of the specifics, don't you?
This one is just focused on these two things that actually have to go together if we and the people we care about will flourish. I actually think of a leader as someone who cares more about others flourishing than their own. Like, when I'm a leader in a given context, what matters to me most is that other people come alive, become everything they were meant to be. That happens when you're a parent, happens when you're a teacher, happens when you're have a title of leadership too. And it turns out that I am pretty sure, and this is what the book's about, that actually we have to have both authority and vulnerability at the same time. And that 2x2 chart is just a way of making it visual, that when you have both, when you're high in authority, which I plot, up and down, and high in vulnerability, if you think about that left to right, if you go up and to the right in that chart, I think you're heading towards real leadership and real flourishing.
Let's talk about the false choice, because that's, of course, the title of your chapter. And most people have it, and if you're, again, looking at your quadrant, they're looking at the upper left-hand corner where there's not a lot of warmth and a lot of authority. And we can think of something like that. Of course, boot camp and maybe even some presidential candidates, but we'll leave that there. And then the lower right-hand corner, indulgent, where you're low on firmness and low on warmth, and that's the pliable parent where the kids run the home. And that seems to be the false choice that is given to us so often in our culture. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. Oh, exactly. And I partly got thinking about these topics by reading about effective parenting. And it turns out that many parents think that they have to choose between these two things. They either think I have to be really high in authority and really strict, or I have to be really warm and emotionally available, in a sense, open. But if you only have one of those, it's actually not healthy either way. So parents who are firm without being warm are authoritarian parents, and parents who are warm without being firm end up being very indulgent. And this is the false choice that we often make. We think we have to choose one of these two, when in fact it turns out that the healthiest style of parenting, and psychologists have actually tracked this for 20, 30 years now, that when parents combine firmness and warmth, when we both offer structure to our kids and consequences and accountability, but we're also emotionally available and open, that is actually what produces children who grow up with confidence, they succeed better on all kinds of measures. And it's a kind of a paradox in a way. You wouldn't think those two things, it doesn't always feel when you're a parent, you don't always know how to keep them together, honestly. But when you can, that leads to flourishing for your child. And so in the book, Strong and Weak, I talk about this not just applying to parenting styles, but actually many of our choices in life are choices where we have to both choose authority, which is capacity for meaningfully acting, doing something that really matters and being able to do it, and also choose vulnerability and risk at the same time. And it turns out that's where the real life happens.
Again, book is entitled Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love and Risk and True Flourishing. It's published by InterVarsity Press, and you can find that with some of the other books we've mentioned today, Playing God as well as Culture Making. And just before we take a break, we've already gone from preaching to meddling in terms of parenting. Let's talk about that in terms of the church, because you have the Christian world has its own versions. Is the mission of the church evangelism and proclamation, or is it justice and demonstration? Are we supposed to be conservative or radical? We have these dichotomies all over the place, even within the Christian world, don't we?
All these false choices where we think, well, it has to be one or the other. And so often it's both. So often it turns out the real interesting things, in a way, about being a Christian are holding two things together that actually go together. Grace and works, if you want a really heavy theology topic. It really is both in the end. It's not one or the other. So we have to avoid that false choice and find a way to integrate two things that really go together and bring life.
Well, we're going to come back after the break and spend a little bit of time talking through this with Andy Crouch, Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love, Risk, and True Flourishing. And we'll get into some of those quadrants. But again, if you might want to draw a little diagram on the y-axis, north-south is authority. On the x-axis is vulnerability, or you could put firmness and warmth, either way. And we're going to work our way through that. Certainly we'll talk about the positive, which is flourishing. But what about the others? Exploiting and withdrawing and suffering, and some of the kinds of things that we deal with you have a kind individual or an absent individual, an authoritarian individual or an indulgent one. I think it's just a really good way to understand some of these concepts, and if nothing else, will help you be a better parent, a better leader in the church, and certainly a leader in your own business community, and perhaps some of you might even run for
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Congress is considering a bill to fight government zombies. That's the name that Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers gives to the many government programs that have never been reauthorized by Congress. These Walking Dead programs continue to function with little or no government oversight. Her bill would gradually cut funding for unauthorized government programs in order to compel Congress to take action on them. Currently, the federal government funds 256 unauthorized programs costing $310 billion. This even includes entire. And that raises a point. Would Congress refuse to refund the State Department? Well, certainly not. But imagine the oversight that would occur if even the State Department had to come to Congress and explain its action. Representative Rodgers notes that many of these agencies have become arrogant. They've become disconnected from their mission, and she believes that this bill restores accountability with the elected representatives. Under the bill, the programs that have expired authorizations would be subject to a 10% spending cut the first year of unauthorized status and a 15% cut in the second and third years. If Congress fails to reauthorize after that time, the program will be sunsetted. All funding would disappear. In addition to the sunset process, the bill also creates a Spending Accountability Commission to oversee the authorization schedule and review all mandatory spending programs. Citizens and candidates all complain about the spending and the lack of accountability that we rarely see in concrete programs that would change the current system in Washington. An automatic cut in spending will get the attention of the agency and the members of Congress. This is the type of fiscal discipline we need in Congress. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Now playing, rated PG, miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Andy Crouch. His book is entitled Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love, Risk, and True Flourishing. We have a link to andy-crouch.com, but again, you don't even have to know how to spell it. We have a link there, and you can order the book from him if you would like to do so. It is published by InterVarsity Press. Probably will be able to find it in your local Christian bookstore, but if not, we made it very easy for you to follow. And again, I'm encouraging you to follow along and maybe write on a piece of paper on the y-axis authority, on the x-axis vulnerability. And if you do that, you will see then that you have 4 quadrants. We're going to work our way through those 4 quadrants and then, of course, open up for your comments or questions. In that upper right-hand corner, which is chapter 2 of your book, Andy, you talk about flourishing. And that really kind of ties into the statement that Jesus makes, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. That's really the goal if we are going to be good leaders inside and outside the church, isn't it?
Yes, fullness of life. I love that phrase, and I think that's what what flourishing really refers to. And I also think about Paul, and I think it's 2 Timothy, one of his letters to Timothy, talks about the life that really is life. There's a kind of life that doesn't really count as flourishing life. It's not what we're made for, but there is a life that really is life. And I think it involves this kind of up and to the right in our graph, this idea of authority and vulnerability together, strength and weakness together actually are a flourishing life.
And I might just mention that as people are maybe making some notes under flourishing, you could put the one I just gave you, John 10:10. And then, of course, you just mentioned 1 Timothy 6:19, because these are passages that would be really good. And hint, those of you that are pastors, Sunday school leaders, this would be a great book to get, to teach through, maybe a small group lesson to really get people thinking about these kinds of things. But flourishing oftentimes you've got to understand what that is. In some respects, you spend a little bit of time explaining what it's not, and that is flourishing. Sometimes people think is the same thing as growth, or it's affluence, it's success. That's not really what we're talking about, is it?
No, and I think one of the challenges is we've been very let's put it this way, we've been very well discipled by all the commercials that we watch, and they tell us what a good life is. It involves being pretty young, pretty fit, having lots of money to spend, and frankly, any of us, I think anyone, even the people who act in those commercials, probably when they watch other commercials, feel like, boy, I'm never going to measure up to that life. And the good news is that has very little to do with true flourishing, because the one human being who actually lived a fully flourishing life, I don't think he had a lot of extra money. There was nothing notable about his appearance, Isaiah 53 says. Sometimes he was really popular, at other times no one paid attention to him, and yet everywhere he went, it wasn't just he who was flourishing. In fact, that was probably the least important thing to him. It was that other people around him were healed, other people around him were freed from all kinds of things. And so flourishing ends up not just being about me and my life, but about what I'm bringing into the world and what I'm offering to other people. And in order for that to happen, I don't actually need any of the things that our sort of modern consumer culture tells me I need, but I do need to become a different kind of person than the one we often choose to be, and that's what real life is about.
Flourishing has both high authority and high vulnerability. And let me take each one of those for just a minute. There are people, Andy, right now saying, well, I don't have any authority. I mean, and you really, what you say is, well, yes, you do. Psalm 8 is a good example. As human beings, we have a stewardship authority over God's creation, don't we?
Yeah, and to your list of, places in the Bible where we can see flourishing, I'd add Genesis 1 and 2, where God creates human beings in his image, male and female, and they're given dominion, it says, over everything on the earth, everything that's living, and the glory of being a human being is that we're not just another one of the creatures. We are a creature, but we're not just like the other creatures. We are actually given responsibility for the whole world. And God says to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. There's this kind of command to be involved in caring for the whole world. And that means if you are a human being, no matter how much authority or how little authority other people give you, God has set his image on you. And if you're reborn in Christ, you now have the seal of that in the Holy Spirit, and you are given authority. We all have authority, no matter how much or how little we have in any given human system or human situation.
Wow, very good. So that's high authority. The other one is, if you will, high vulnerability. Now, let me play upon the fact that you have been so involved with the International Justice Mission. Some people, when they think vulnerability, they think of human trafficking, sexual slavery, those kinds of things. There are different kinds of vulnerability. Explain what we really are talking about here.
That's right. So, and we'll talk in a few minutes, I'm sure, about what it's like to have vulnerability without authority, and that is to be exploited in the way that organizations like IGEM work on. But there's another kind of vulnerability that is matched with authority, and it involves proper dependence on others, proper openness to others. And interestingly, we find this, well, you mentioned Psalm 8. The psalmist who talks about being made in the image of God also looks up at the heavens and says, when I look at the work of your hands, Lord, what are human beings that you're mindful of us? There's this incredible sense of smallness. And in Genesis 2, the man and the woman are dependent on each other, and they're dependent on God. And they're also, by the way, described as naked, which is a kind of vulnerability. So isn't it interesting that at the beginning, when everything was as it was meant to be for human beings, we both had dominion over the world, high authority, but also had very high vulnerability. They were naked, though without shame. And I think that indicates that real, healthy human life is not just about having power, if you will. It's about having power that's held in an open way, that other people are involved in my life. I'm accountable to other people. I'm in relationship with other people. And that's a vulnerable thing. But when you think about the best moments in a marriage, the best moments in parenting, and the best moments in leadership, they all have both capacity for meaningful action, which is authority, but also exposure to meaningful risk. I know as a parent, I mean, my kids, especially when children are small, they see you as they think of their parents as pure authority.
Yes.
But when you're actually a parent, you know that, yes, I have a lot of power to make a difference in my children's lives, especially early on. But wow, it's vulnerable to be a parent at the same time. And that's actually the way it's meant to be, the two together.
Well, again, the book is entitled Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love, Risk, and True Flourishing. And of course, we've talked about flourishing, but now for a little bit, we're going to talk about the negatives. And one of those, which you've already alluded to, is suffering. That would be in the lower right-hand corner for those of you that are drawing the little chart. And that would be where you have high vulnerability but low authority. Well, these are the people that sometimes for generations have been exploited. True?
Yes, exactly. And you know, this is really in many ways, it's the worst place to be, and yet, kind of the great, terrible irony is it's probably the most common human experience.
Unfortunately.
In that, you know, many of the billions of people who share the planet with us right now, today, their reality is almost entirely of vulnerability, and they have no real capacity for meaningful action because of the social systems they live in, the governments they live under, their lack of economic opportunity. There are many different sources of this. But it is very possible, even though you're made in the image of God, even though you're meant to flourish, the world is broken, and the way it's broken is that many people end up in this corner called suffering. And actually, of all four corners, all the four combinations of authority and vulnerability, this is the one that whoever I'm with, I can know at some point in our life we've experienced this. I mean, all of us, no matter how protected or fortunate our lives have had moments where we just felt completely vulnerable and there was nothing we could do to change the situation. The great news for us as Christians is that even God has visited that place.
Yes.
God is not afraid of that place. God is present even to those in that place. We just celebrated Easter, and what comes before Easter is Good Friday and the cross. And on the cross, Jesus, in a way, even though, he knows that he could call down a legion of angels, he says, but in that moment, he really is all vulnerability, at least from any human point of view, and no authority. He's immobile, and he goes to death where no capacity for action. So, I mean, it's a dark place to be, but it's actually a place that our Savior visited and triumphed over as well. So even though it's a human reality, it doesn't have to be the last word in any human story.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Andy Crouch. And also when we come back, I'll talk a little bit about some of the resources on his webpage. And I would certainly commend you not only this book we're talking about today, Strong and Weak, but some of the other InterVarsity Press books that we've mentioned, Playing God and Culture Making. We've talked about each one of those. And by the way, if you'd like to listen to previous interviews we've done with Andy Crouch, you can go to our website, do the search engine. You can download the podcast or the livecast on our YouTube channel and watch it. And certainly we'll come back and pick a little bit more off of that quadrant. We've talked about flourishing and suffering. We'll come back and talk about withdrawing and exploiting. And a little bit later, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to weigh in with some of your comments if you'd like. It's one of those ones where you kind of sit back and take some notes and certainly even take the opportunity to get a copy of the book and read it for yourself. And for those of you in positions of leadership, this would be a good book for you, but it would be a good book to actually use to teach those in your sphere of influence. So we'll take a break and we'll come back, continue our conversation with Andy Crouch, Strong and Weak. And as you go to the website, don't forget, we're still encouraging you to click on that button that says donate. We'll be back right after this.
Look at the presidential campaign and you tell me, does America need more or less of a Christian witness right now? Today is the final day of the first quarter of 2016, and support for Point of View is running about 5 weeks behind where it needs to be. Congress can run deficits virtually forever, but we can't. And I plead with you, do something about that today, right now. I'm asking you to stop what you're doing just for a moment. Go online or pick up the phone. Make the most generous investment you can to touch lives across the nation, to teach listeners how to take our faith into the culture. Visit pointofview.net. Make a few clicks and donate now. Pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Please, we need you to respond today. Today, we need you to support Point of View. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for your support.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station.
And I would certainly commend you some of his other books that we've talked about on this program, Playing God and Culture Making. And we also have a link to andycrouch.com. And Andy, let's talk about that for just a minute. This is usually the time in the program where I like to feature the website, which we have a link to on our website. It's andy-crouch.com. And there are some great resources that are available there where in individuals can order the book, but also the study guide. And I know we have lots of listeners that are in some position of leadership. They may be a pastor, they may be a Sunday school teacher, a Bible fellowship leader, maybe have a small group or something like that. So talk about some of the resources that are available on your website.
Well, one thing that's there are lots of short things I've written, so if you're not up for a full book quite yet, you can just click on the articles link, and everything I've written over the years. I think a really interesting piece is the piece I wrote for the Wall Street Journal the day after Steve Jobs died. They asked me to write a big piece about the meaning of his life, and really it ends up being about the limits of his life and leadership, and what he missed by not maybe leading from the gospel, but leading from another kind of gospel. But, I would also say this little book, Strong and Weak, which you can order there, is a great opportunity. I actually say leaders should start reading it at chapter 6, which is where I start talking about the drama of leadership, which is hidden vulnerability, and how we manage vulnerability in our lives as leaders. And then hand it to some of the folks you work with and lead, and start at chapter 1 and start working your way through kind of the good life, which is a flourishing life, but the ways that we often settle for things that aren't really a good life. And then by the time they get to chapter 6 with you, they'll understand better kind of what you're hoping for from the people in the environments where you're leading.
We'll get to chapter 6 in just a minute, but let me finish our quadrant here. And for those of you that just joined us, we're talking about, on the y-axis you have authority, on the x-axis vulnerability, and in the upper right-hand corner is flourishing. The upper right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner is suffering. So then the lower left-hand corner would be withdrawing. And it's interesting because you talk about the fact that a lot of us have found ourselves at one time or another in the suffering quadrant. Almost all of us started in the withdrawing quadrant because that's called safety.
Yeah, when we start our lives as a healthy, when a healthy human life begins, we actually have very little authority and very little vulnerability. And the job of parents is to protect their kids from too much of either one at first, right? Vulnerability, we keep them very much in our sight. We protect them from too much authority too fast, even when they can crawl or toddle or walk. But then the job of parenting is gradually to allow your child, and hopefully most of us had parents who were able to do this to some extent, gradually allow the child to increase in authority and also to take more risks, which is vulnerability. So, I remember walking to school by myself for the first time in kindergarten. We lived in a city where you could, safely walk a couple blocks to school, and that felt like a risk for little 5-year-old me, right? And that's good parenting. It actually increases authority and vulnerability gradually until eventually my own son is now, off to college, and he's got all kinds of authority and is probably taking all kinds of risks, and I feel the vulnerability of that too, and that's where I need to be as his dad at this stage in his life. The problem is that sometimes we choose to kind of retreat back to that state that really I think we're only meant to be in for a short time, and we decide, I think I kind of like not having any authority, and I like not having any risk.
Right.
And if you have enough money or privilege, you can actually choose to live a very insulated life. And one of the things I observe, I'd be curious whether you have picked up on this or think this is true, but it seems to me a lot of American young adults, like kids in college, are often stuck in this kind of withdrawing.
Yes.
That is, they actually are very reluctant to take risks, and they're very reluctant to actually take on authority. So, worst case scenario, you end up in your parents' basement playing video games, and you're not contributing anything to the world. You're not adding anything to the world. It's just a withdrawal from the world.
Yeah.
And I think this is a real temptation, really honestly, in a kind of middle-class, affluent culture where we can just back away from the authority and the vulnerability we were made for.
Yeah, lots of safety, no trigger warnings, none of that. And since you mentioned video, you used the Madden football, and it's a good example there. You can get really good at Madden football. And my guest the first hour is J.C. Watts. He was a quarterback that led the Oklahoma Sooners to 2 championships at Orange Bowl. But that's a little different than somebody who is really good at playing Madden football. And that's, again, it's easy to withdraw and feel like you're playing football or feel like you're racing a car or all sorts of things. And again, this is a generation that grew up with video games, so maybe that, as well as Facebook and all sorts of social media, have created some of that, as well as helicopter parents and snowplow parents. Maybe all of that has contributed, but that's what we find.
Exactly. We have things that simulate real life. Like it feels like you're playing football, and that you're pretty good at it when you're sitting playing that video game. But you're not actually gaining very much real authority in the real world, and you're not taking any real risks. It's just a character on a screen. But I think, I can pick on video games. I don't play video games very much, but social media can be the same thing.
Yes.
It can feel like I'm taking a bold stand for something, or it can feel like I'm taking some action, when in fact it's really just a very thin simulation. So all of us are tempted into this withdrawing quadrant, I think, every day.
One last one, of course, this would be the upper left-hand corner, and that's exploiting with bosses and military leaders and all of the rest. But again, this is something that we need to also address as one other example. And oftentimes it's part of that false choice that we have. People think that if I'm going to be a leader, I'm going to have a lot of authority and very little vulnerability. But that's a false choice, isn't it?
It is a false choice, and it actually, in the long run, it never works. Another word for this, authority without vulnerability, another word for that is control. Mm-hmm. When I want to control someone or some situation, what I really want is to be able to act, but not to have any risk. The problem is the world really isn't set up for any of us to control it. Now, we might say in a way that God has that kind of authority in the world, although God also took a lot of risks in creating us human beings. But we humans, certainly, the world is not a machine. It's not something where if you just have the right code or the right levers, you can make things happen. And definitely your fellow human beings, your fellow people, we can't control people. So the dream of having authority without vulnerability, or the fantasy, you might say, actually leads to exploitation. And exploitation is when I start trying to force you to do what I want you to do. And interestingly, what that means is that my quest to have authority without vulnerability leads to other people, the people I'm trying to control and exploit, ending up in that bottom right-hand corner of suffering, where my quest for authority without vulnerability means they have to have vulnerability without authority. And that's the reality of every dictatorship. It's the reality of many dysfunctional families, unfortunately, where one person is trying to have control, but at the price of real relationship, and other people in the family become really very vulnerable. And it always breaks down eventually. It's not the way we're meant to live, and that's why it's the false choice. It's not going to work out, but it's so seductive to us, and we so wish we could live up there that we will often do a lot, even up to really horrific levels of violence sometimes, to try to keep our lives up in that upper left-hand corner. And in the long run, it'll never work.
And it reminds me of the quote that you use in the book from Max Dupree: bad leaders inflict pain, good leaders bear it. And sometimes the implication is that, I've got to teach everybody in my, whatever group it would be, in my business, in my church, in our particular outreach group, that we're going to treat this pretty much like boot camp. And you're going to be getting a lot of pain because I'm going to inflict it, whereas good leaders actually absorb it, right?
Absolutely. And, even in the military where there are, moments of training, and this is probably true of every, developing real skill and strength always requires a certain amount of suffering, I think. But great military leaders, we know, don't act this way. They actually are in there with their men or with the people in their unit. They are taking huge risks on behalf of the people that they lead. And so we know that healthy leadership doesn't do this, but it is so easy to become an unhealthy leader. And strangely, we often tolerate it or even welcome it, because those leaders promise us if you give me a lot of power, I'll insulate you from risk. They promise that we can somehow live without vulnerability. That's really not true. That isn't true for a nation. It's not true for a family, not true for a company. But we entrust ourselves to these authoritarian leaders sometimes, at some points in history, in the hope that they'll protect us from the things, the risks that we fear.
Andy Crouch with us. When we come back, we'll talk about hidden vulnerability. It's all part of the book, Strong and Weak. It's published by InterVarsity Press. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Andy Crouch with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Strong and Weak. And I wanted to focus on this idea of, talk about the books we've published, not the books that nobody ever wanted to print. They talk about, our family, but not the mistakes we made in raising our kids. And yet those are true as well. And you even tell a story about getting a new pair of shoes and they were slippery. And so you almost fell on your face in this hardwood floor and spent the next 20 minutes being very careful about where you walk. So sometimes being a leader and being in front of a group, people have no idea of some of the vulnerabilities that you have. And that, I think, is part of leadership as well, isn't it?
I think it is in some ways the central drama of leadership. If drama is the sort of engine of our lives, the things that we're trying to work out as we live our lives, if you're a leader, and again, as we said at the top of the show, a leader is not just someone with a title, but someone who cares about others flourishing and is in some position to help other people flourish. You're going to find yourself very often, maybe always, with some level of vulnerability that other people don't see or can't see. And this is just, it's sort of part of the package, because the reality is when I'm, I had that moment with these brand new shoes. As I was being, I had a great introduction. Someone was very warm and, flattering and all those things. Mm-hmm. And I get up and I can just feel this very new sole of this leather shoe. Like I nearly took a total tumble, which would have just been so embarrassing. But no one else knew that. Now, then I had to speak for, 20, 30 minutes. And it's not my job at that moment to tell everybody that because it would distract them. It was already distracting me. It's not what I came there to do. I have to somehow find a way to live with that and not reveal it. Well, that's a very minor thing. But the reality is we all know things about the business. If you're a business leader, you know things about the profit and loss statement that's coming up, or, your relationship with your investors, or that one big customer whose account really matters. And it's not really appropriate often for leaders to disclose all of that. If you're the pastor in a church, people come to you with their deepest, most painful secrets, and you have to hold on to those even as you lead the whole congregation. And the question of how we live with this hidden vulnerability is whether we're going to live with it in a healthy way, such that we can actually lead other people to flourishing in spite of all the risks we know that we bear, or whether we're going to live with it in an unhealthy way. Because remember, authority without vulnerability can be exploiting. It can become the quest for control and the quest for unjust power. And what happens when leaders don't know how to deal with hidden vulnerability in a healthy way is we actually become little dictators, and we actually start to live out that lie that we don't have any risk and any vulnerability.
You also talk about this idea of willing to descend, and there are all sorts of ways we can talk about it, descend into death literally, but I use the example of Philip Ryken, who was giving the address at Wheaton College, and he said it was the spring semester of the academic year and I was in trouble, and he titled that, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," and he was talking about his descent into depression, but of course after he gave it, he said, well, maybe I should now title it, "Everyone Knows the Trouble I've Seen." So sometimes that vulnerability is a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is the other part of leadership, is sometimes we actually have to choose way more vulnerability than others are asking for or looking for. And that can take the form of a very risky personal disclosure, as Dr. Ryken did in talking about his own experience with depression. That's not something college presidents normally do. It's not something probably they should do every day, even if it is a reality in their lives, but it is something you might choose to do at a particular moment for the sake of the flourishing of your community. And of course, we follow the ultimate leader, the ultimate human being, Jesus, who didn't just hold on to life. He actually, at a certain point in his public ministry, Luke says, he set his face for Jerusalem, and he didn't go there because it was going to give him all kinds of worldly power. He went knowing there would be a confrontation that would lead to his death, and he did that in order to save the world. And now none of us have to die to save the world. Thank goodness Jesus took care of that. But we do have to carry our cross. And I think that the other thing leaders do is at certain crucial moments, they actually voluntarily give up power. They voluntarily give up things that could be theirs so that the community that they lead will flourish.
Well, just a great insight in this book, Strong and Weak. And again, I would commend to individuals some of the other books, Playing God and Culture Making. And Andy Crouch, we always have a great time doing these interviews. Let's do it again sometime.
I would love to. I so appreciate the chance, Kerby. Thanks very much.
That's all we have for today. Tomorrow is our weekend edition, and we have a lot to cover in terms of many issues in the news, so that is certainly one way in which we can educate you about what's been taking place this week. And, of course, we have a primary next week. We've had some very significant events we've been talking about in Georgia and North Carolina. We have some lessons I think we can learn from what's been happening in Europe to what we would apply here. So all sorts of issues are on the table to talk about to last day and really the last hour of our broadcast in the first quarter of 2016. And so one last time, wanted to encourage you to help us close the gap. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, and click on the button there, there is an opportunity for you to give. March 31st marks the end of our financial quarter, and that is something that is certainly noteworthy, but even more so, as you've heard me mention before, we're running about 5 weeks behind where we should be, and there are some reasons for that financial downfall, and some of it is unexpected, some of it is maybe somewhat predictable during an election season. We've seen it before, but for whatever reason, we're encouraging those of you that have appreciated some of the conversations we've had just over the last couple of days, and certainly over this last quarter, to do what you can to help us out. Now, some of you may have never supported Point of View before, so let me just give you the opportunity to consider maybe even making a gift. The email I sent out here talked about maybe even a gift of $5, just to say, okay, well, I'll give you $5 just to let you know that I'm out there and listening to you and appreciate what you're doing, and I've got some great material that I've been able to download from Point of View. I've been listening to you for years, and I've run into all sorts of people that have listened to us for years and have never made a gift, and so if you're one of those individuals, I would encourage you to do so. Maybe it's a relatively new program that you're listening to. Every once in a while, I'll have somebody come on the air and say, this is the first time I've heard the program. And some of them actually have become donors, which is kind of intriguing to only hear a program once and to send in a donation. That's really an encouragement. And for those of you that are supporters, if you can add a special gift, that would help us kind of get to where we need to be. So all of it available at the website, pointofview.net. Just click on that button that says Help Close the Gap. And so that resource is there. As you go there, don't forget, what you're supporting is not just a 2-hour program, but all the other resources. For example, if you wanted to listen to this program again and listen to the interview we did with J.C. Watts and the interview we did with Andy Crouch, I would encourage you to download the podcast. It will be up there shortly, if not already there. And then shortly we'll also, of course, have the Livecast, so you can go to the YouTube channel and see some of the interviews that we've done in the past. And, of course, my commentary is there. The one today is on government zombies. And if you wonder, what in the world? This is an attempt to stop some of these zombie programs, kind of like The Living Dead. There are all sorts of programs, interestingly enough, that have never been reauthorized by the government. And so Kathy McMorris Rogers has come up with a way to deal with these 256 unauthorized programs that cost us $310 billion. So again, that's another resource available to you. Of course, we have our Pray, Organize, and Vote. And so that's why we encourage you to support this ministry. It's a way in which we have been able to educate various generations, and now we're educating the next generation to begin to think biblically about every area of life and apply those principles to their life and to the various arenas. And so please take the time, if you would, just as we go off the air, to visit the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to write to us, the announcer will give you the address. It's very simple. Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila. We'll see you back here tomorrow for Weekend Edition.
From Pure Flix comes God's Not Dead 2. A classroom answer to an honest question about Jesus could cost Grace Wesley the teaching career she loves.
I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God.
God's Not Dead 2. In theaters April 1st. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at godsnotdead.com.
You don't have to look very hard to see that America needs a strong and thoughtful Christian witness. Today is the end of the first quarter of 2016, and support for Point of View is running about 5 whole weeks behind. Please stop what you're doing just for a moment and make the most generous investment you can to touch lives across the nation. Visit pointofview.net, make a few clicks, and donate now. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Today is the day. We need you to respond right now. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I want to